The crowd outside roared like a tidal wave crashing against the walls of the Albuquerque Civic Auditorium in 1972. The anticipation was electric, alive, a current that coursed through every seat and every trembling hand clutching a ticket. Spotlights were poised to ignite the stage, sequins waiting to blaze under the fire of applause. The king of rock and roll was minutes away from stepping out into the storm. Yet, just beyond the heavy velvet curtain, hidden from the screaming thousands, Elvis Presley was not smiling, not preparing his famous swagger, not even humming the notes that would soon shake the earth. Instead, he was kneeling. His white jumpsuit shimmered faintly under the dim backstage lights as he bent low before a fragile child whose life was slipping away. Her name was Denise Sanchez. She was only 8 years old, her body frail from leukemia, her eyes impossibly bright with the wonder of seeing her hero. In that hushed corner, the world's most powerful performer was simply a man, holding her hand, whispering softly, and fighting back tears. Before we walk deeper into this untold story of Elvis Presley, I want to invite you to take a step further with us. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss these rare, heart-stirring glimpses into history. Hit the like button if this moment already touches something deep inside you. Share this with friends or family who still believe in the humanity behind the legend, and comment below with your own memories or feelings about Elvis Presley. Your voice matters, and together we can keep the legacy of the king of rock and roll alive. The story of that night has been retold for decades, whispered through fan circles, captured fleetingly in outtakes from the documentary Elvis on Tour. It is more than an anecdote, it is a portrait of Elvis Presley at his most human. He was at the height of his career, the king standing taller than ever on the shoulders of his own legend. But the meeting with Denise Sanchez stripped all of that away. What remained was a man who cared, who cried, who carried a child's hope in his heart as though it were his own. Denise's journey to that night had begun long before the curtain ever rose. She was a little girl from New Mexico who loved Elvis Presley's music with a devotion that defied her fragile condition. When the radio sang his songs, she smiled. When her mother spoke of him, she listened with wide-eyed wonder. But her illness, merciless and consuming, made the idea of attending a crowded concert impossible. The doctors said she was too weak, too vulnerable. Dreams, however, have a way of fighting for survival, even when bodies cannot. Denise's mother wrote a letter to a local newspaper, not for pity, but in desperation to grant her daughter one final joy. That letter found its way into the right hands, and eventually, Elvis Presley himself learned of the child who longed to see him. By 1972, Elvis was no stranger to fan requests. He had been hounded for years by those who wanted a piece of him, an autograph, a handshake, a scarf from the stage. But this request was different. This was not about fame or memorabilia. This was about life, about a fleeting chance to give happiness where time was cruel. Elvis agreed without hesitation. A meeting was arranged before his Albuquerque concert, one that would alter not only the night but the hearts of all who witnessed it. Backstage, the atmosphere was tense but tender. The hum of stage equipment, the muted buzz of distant fans, the quiet shuffling of crew members preparing for a storm, it all felt suspended in a kind of sacred silence when Denise was brought in. She wore a dress that seemed too big for her fragile frame, and a scarf around her head that did little to disguise the toll of her illness. But her smile was radiant, filled with more life than anyone expected. She saw him, her hero, and her world lit up. "Elvis," she whispered, her voice soft yet firm, as if she had known him all her life. He knelt to meet her. The man who had commanded millions of hearts with a single shake of his hips now bent low, his sequined sleeves brushing the floor as he took her tiny hand into his. His eyes softened, and his smile, that legendary smile, melted into something entirely different, pure tenderness. Those who stood nearby saw something extraordinary. For a moment, the king of rock and roll vanished, and in his place was a man whose heart had cracked wide open. He spoke to her quietly. Words of encouragement, of hope, of love. No cameras intruded, no reporters scribbled notes. These were words meant only for Denise, spoken from one soul to another. She giggled faintly, her face glowing, her small fingers gripping his hand as though she were holding on to the very magic she had dreamed of for so long. when the time came for Elvis to step onto the stage, the energy of the crowd surged into him. The lights burst alive, the band thundered, and the audience screamed his name with unrestrained passion. But beneath the power of the performance, there was something different in Elvis that night. Something changed backstage had seeped into his soul, fueling every lyric, every movement. Midway through the concert, he paused. The crowd hushed, waiting, sensing something profound. Elvis looked out into the sea of faces, his gaze distant, heavy with the memory of what had just happened. His voice caught slightly as he spoke. "This one's for Denise," he said, and then, the music began. "You gave me a mountain." The song had always been a ballad of struggle and endurance, but that night it became something transcendent. Elvis sang not to thousands but to one little girl whose fight was larger than life. Each word was a prayer, each note a gift. His voice carried the weight of her struggle, the sorrow of her mother, the fragility of her childhood. The emotion overwhelmed him. His eyes filled, and under the blinding stage lights, Elvis Presley cried. Not as an entertainer, not as a king, but as a man who felt the unfairness of the world press down on him, who allowed himself to grieve even as he gave everything he had to the music. Fans in the audience may not have understood the depth of that dedication, but those who knew, those who had seen him with Denise backstage, never forgot. It was not a spectacle. It was a sacred offering of empathy and love, the kind of moment that strips away legends and reveals the humanity beneath. Denise did not live long after that night. Her battle with leukemia ended too soon, leaving her family with the bittersweet memory of a dream fulfilled and a life cut short. Yet, her story, woven into the larger tapestry of Elvis Presley's legacy, endured. Fans whispered it across generations, cherishing it as one of the most profound untold stories of the king of rock and roll. It was preserved in pieces of outtakes from Elvis on tour, surfacing here and there like fragments of a sacred text. And every time it was told, it reminded the world of who Elvis truly was. Because Elvis Presley was not just the man who revolutionized music, who shattered cultural norms, who stood at the epicenter of one of the greatest musical revolutions in history. He was also the man who bent down to comfort a sick child, who gave away Cadillacs to strangers, who donated quietly to charities, who reached out to people others overlooked. He was a man defined not only by the roar of stadiums but by the quiet tears shed backstage. The untold story of Elvis Presley is not only about fame and fortune. It is about contradiction, the king adored by millions but aching with loneliness, the performer dressed in rhinestones but carrying a private weight of grief, the legend who gave everything on stage but gave even more in small, hidden acts of kindness. The story of Denise Sanchez is one of those moments where the contradictions dissolve, and what remains is simply the truth of a man's heart. Elvis had always been close to the pain of loss. His mother, Gladys, was the anchor of his life, and her death in 1958 left him shattered. He carried that wound through every triumph, every applause, every encore. Perhaps that was why Denise's struggle pierced him so deeply. He saw in her the echo of his own vulnerability, the reminder that love is fleeting, that life is fragile, that even the king of rock and roll could not hold back the tide of mortality. And so he did what he could. He gave her his presence, his words, his song, his tears. Even today, more than 4 decades after his passing, the memory of that night holds its power. Fans revisit it not only to admire Elvis Presley the performer but to feel Elvis Presley the man. They recall the softness in his eyes, the tremble in his voice, the way the king wept for a child who adored him. These are the moments that build legacies not of fame but of humanity. When we talk about Elvis Presley, the untold story, we often focus on the scandals, the headlines, the glittering concerts. But the truth is that his legacy is stitched together as much by the quiet acts as by the loud ones. A backstage meeting in Albuquerque in 1972 might not have made front-page news, but it made an eternal impact. It showed us that even in the blinding glare of celebrity, kindness can still bloom in the shadows. And so, when you think of the king of rock and roll, remember not only the jumpsuits, the music, the crowds. Remember the little girl named Denise Sanchez and the night Elvis Presley cried. Remember that legends are not made only of power and glory, but of compassion, vulnerability, and love. In the end, what makes the story of Elvis Presley and Denise Sanchez unforgettable is not simply the meeting itself, but what it represents. It is a reminder that even at the peak of fame, when the world demanded constant performance and perfection, Elvis remained deeply human. He carried with him a heart that could be moved, eyes that could fill with tears, and a spirit willing to pause everything for the sake of one fragile life. That is the essence of the untold story, the truth that behind the king of rock and roll was a man who lived not just for music but for the connection it created with people. Denise's smile that night may have been brief, but it was eternal in its impact. For her, it was a dream fulfilled, a spark of joy in the shadow of illness. For Elvis, it was a moment of reckoning, a reminder that his greatest gift was not his fame, nor his wealth, nor even the roar of the audience. His greatest gift was his ability to touch souls, one at a time, even if the world never knew. That quiet act of kindness has lasted longer than many headlines, living on in the hearts of fans who continue to tell the story, generation after generation, and perhaps that is the true legacy of Elvis Presley. Not only the records he broke or the stages he conquered, but the love he gave when no one was watching. That is the king the world remembers, and the king we continue to honor. If this story has touched you, if it has reminded you of the fragile beauty of life and the humanity of Elvis Presley, then join us in keeping his legacy alive. Subscribe to our channel so these untold stories never fade. Like this video if you believe in the power of kindness. Share it with someone who still listens to Elvis Presley late at night, and comment below with your own memories of the king of rock and roll. Together, we can carry forward not only the legend but the heart of the man who wore the crown.